Welcome to Testing Guru. And in last video we have seen what are the different types of testing and 7 software testing principles, and we have seen the examples, and also we have seen the V model in software testing and the STLC, the software testing lifecycle, different phases of it, entry and exit criteria of it. Okay, so if you haven't gone through this video, I will provide the link in the description. You can refer that. And today we are going to learn about how we can develop test cases. So to develop a test case, we have to go through different steps. So first step is like we have to understand what are the test bases in software testing. So based on that, like how we develop the test cases and what is the test scenario, and I will go over the template and examples also, and how to write test cases, and I'll show some example how we write it, and also we'll learn about the requirement traceability, RTM, and example template. And the main important thing in testing is like we have to have a test data, and how we generate the test data, and what is that test data means, and examples, and what are the tools we can use it for generating. Those also will go in this session, and sample test case template, either in the Excel format or the Word format. We'll see about that as well. So first thing is like test basis. So possible test basis is, what is meant by test basis? So test basis are like basically the reference for the testing. To start the testing, we need to have some reference document or reference where we can refer to test that or prepare our test cases. So we need to have some reference, that is called the test basis. So there are possible test bases are system requirement document, that is also called as SRS, functional specification document, that is called FSD, technical design document, that is called TDD, and user manuals, use cases, source code, and business requirement documents, so that is called BRD. So there are different documents we refer to develop our test cases. So these are some of the main documents usually the testers will refer. Okay, now we'll move on to what is test scenario. So we heard in many cases like test scenario, test cases. So what is meant by test scenario? Test scenario is defined as a functionality that can be tested. Okay, it is also called as a test condition or a test possibility. Test scenario and test cases, there are two different things. Okay, so test scenario is what to be tested, and test case is how to be tested. So this is the main difference between the test scenario and test case. So we'll see how it is different in the example. Like please take a look at difference between the test scenario and test cases in the below condition. For example, if test scenario is to validate a login page, that is called a test scenario. Okay, to validate the login page, we have to perform certain actions, or we have to follow certain steps. Those are called test cases. So first step to login, to validate the login page is you have to enter the username and password. That is the first test case. Second test case is reset your password, and third test case is enter invalid credential, and fourth is valid credential. So we have to test with a different steps, but the main scenario is to validate the login page. So that is called test scenario. So next we will move on to how do we write test cases. Okay, so there is a sample template. I'll go through it with an example. Okay, so here in your screen you can see when we write test cases or a there is a template, like we have to have test case ID. The test case ID is like the unique ID to identify the test cases which you write it. So you can give any unique ID is a test case ID, either a test TC01 or TU01. So it is depends, like different people use different IDs. And next one is the test case description. So in test case description, so we have to write what we are going to write as a part of test step or a test case. So that is in this case, like check the customer login with a valid data. So another test case, check customer login with invalid data. So there are multiple test cases you can write, and for each test case you have to have a unique ID called test case ID. Okay, and after test case description, you have to write the test step. Okay, so we learned in the last in last section, like what is test scenario and test case. So test scenario is very high level, and test case is one step below that, like where we have different test cases, and after test cases we have further divided into the test steps. So to achieve that test case, what steps we are going to follow? For example, we go to the site, that is the first step, to validate the customer login with the valid data, and enter the valid user ID, enter the password, click submit. So these are the different steps. Okay, and we have to write those test steps to understand the test cases better, and also we have to provide the test data. So test data is like we have to give certain user ID, password. So those are considered as the test data for this login test case. Okay, and we also have to mention what is expected results. Okay, so when you give a customer login with a valid data, so what it should be, what is the output, like how it should behave? User should be able to log into the application, and when you give invalid data, user should not be able to log into the application. That is an expected result. So whenever there is an expected result is matching with the actual result, then test case will get passed. Okay, if it is actual result is not matching with the expected result, then your test case will fail. Okay, so this is all about how we write a test case. Okay, so to write a test case, we need to keep something in mind. Okay, while writing any test scenarios or a test cases. So when we write a test scenario, those should be reviewed by the product manager, business analyst, or anyone who else understands the requirements really well, and all the stakeholders. And second point is, like, we should have a domain knowledge that is important to get the deeper understanding of the application. And third point is we must cover the negative and out of box testing with the test to break attitude. We have to think always to break the application and prepare our test cases with the negative and out of box scenarios. Okay, and next is, like, scenario mapping should be done to make sure that each and every requirement is directly mapped to the number of scenarios. It helps avoiding any misses with the requirement. So we'll learn more about that in the next slide. So ensure that every identified scenario is a story in itself. So you have to have a scenario in a very detailed manner, so that you what is the requirement from the business, or how the user will be using that application. So in that case, you have to think and write our test scenarios. So next we'll move on to requirement traceability matrix. So what is requirement traceability matrix? Okay, so requirement traceability matrix is also called as RTM, is a document that maps or traces the requirement with the test cases. The main purpose of requirement traceability matrix is to validate that all the requirements are checked via test cases, such that no functionality is unchecked during software testing. So it means, like, when we map the requirement with the test cases, we will not miss any requirement to validate it. So there will not be any misses compared to the requirements. So that's the reason, like, we have to always have requirement traceability matrix prepared. Okay, so what parameters to include in the requirement traceability matrix and how it looks, that you can see in the screen. Like, there is a requirement ID, requirement type, and description. So whenever we get any requirement, it will have some requirement ID to it and requirement description to it. Okay, so those are related to the requirement document. And we saw in the last slide how the test case will be developed and what are the statuses. So here you can see there are test case ID, test case description, steps, actual result, expected results, and the last one is pass or fail. So in that we will be considering a test case ID, which is a unique ID, as well as the status where it is passed or failed, and that we are going to map with the requirement ID and requirement description. So when we map the requirement ID and requirement description with a test case number or a test case ID and show the status, it will clearly show which test scenario or which requirement is covered as part of test case and what is the status of it. And if it is passed or it is not passed, those details also it will show as part of this requirement traceability matrix. So it will give a complete picture and to the all the business stakeholders or the business users, so that they'll get a confidence that the application which is being tested, what is the status of it. So we'll get a complete clear picture of that with the requirement traceability matrix. This is very important whenever you are missing any requirement, then you may have a lot of defects in your application. So those can be avoided using this requirement traceability matrix. So next one is like test data. Test data is the important part of any test execution process, because whenever we write a test case, to execute that we need to have certain test data. So how do we generate the test data and what it is actually, we'll go in this slide. Okay, so test data in the software testing is the input given to the software program during the test execution. It represents the data that affects or affected by the software execution while testing. Test data is used for both positive and negative testing to verify that function produces the expected results for the given input, and for the negative testing to test the software ability to handle the unusual or exceptions or unexpected inputs. Okay, so this is about a test data. And like, how do we create that or generate the test data? So there are different ways to generate that. So first is like manually we can create the test data, or we can mass copy the test data from the production to the testing environment so that we get the test data, and mass copy of test data from the legacy client to the system. Or also we can use the automated test data generation tools. That also will help us to create a test data and use it for the test execution. So we have to have test data which covers positive scenarios and negative scenarios as well. So positive scenarios is like wherever we give a right data or valid data, so the application behaves as expected. But when we give a negative data which is not expected, in that case how the application behaves, how the exception handling is done in the application, and how it reacts to the invalid data. So those things we can check with a negative test data. Okay, so now we'll move to the next slide, which is test case template. Okay, so test case template is the document where we can create either in the Excel or the Word format, and it will have the details of test cases, test case ID, okay, and test case description, and who has created it. And whenever we test cases are created, we also get a reviewed, right? So there is a column called reviewed by, and we have to maintain the version. So once the test cases are written, it is not the final version, because you have to get it reviewed, and whenever there is any comments, you have to update the test case document. So that versioning also has to be tracked. So this is the draft version, or this is the next version. So we'll be having a version called version column, and who has written the test case and who is executing, those information also has to be captured. And when the data is the date of testing is done for this particular scenario, and what is the status of it. So this is on the overall test case template part. But main thing is like we have to have a preconditions for the test cases, and we have to have a test data, and also like we need to have test scenario as we discussed in the earlier slide, and we should have a steps to it. So and steps as well as test step details and expected results for each steps and actual results, and when it is whether it is a pass or a fail or not executed status, or any dependencies are there, you can mention all those status here. So this all about the test case template, and if you want, I can add a test case sample test case template in the description. Let me know if you need any other information. You can comment me. This is all about today's video, and in next video we will be learning testing techniques. So we have to have certain testing techniques with a test case design and some examples, and what is the boundary value analysis and equivalence partitioning with examples I will explain, and decision table testing, those also we'll learn, and what is the state transition testing, what is the diagram of it and the techniques, and also we'll learn about use case testing and what's about and this use case testing techniques also, and that's all in the next video. See you again, and thank you.